Hello, everybody. This is chapter 5 lecture. So we've been through all of the ancient world, and then chapter 4 covered a whole lot of different religions and kind of how they started and their founders and some of their major ideas. And then, just so you know, for the next couple of chapters 5 and 6, are going to deal far more with Europe than any of the other places, mainly because this is really humanities, at least as most of the textbooks deal with it, deals much more with Western society than Eastern. We're going to brush upon some other groups as well as we go. So we will talk about feudalism, for instance, but I'll also talk about feudalism in Japan because theirs was really pretty parallel to ours, even though Japanese culture and European culture was pretty much kept separate. But we're going to talk a little bit about, there were some trade elements that went through with the East, China, Japan, and India, and the Middle East, but also what separated it. And the reason we're going to separate a bit is because of religion, actually, probably more primarily than any other reason, Europe is going to be separate from much of the rest of the world for many centuries. And the vast majority of the cause of why is that the Roman Catholic Church is kind of going to take over much of the governance and the structure of European society. Now, some of it is because when Rome was sacked by the Germanic tribes were largely nomadic and they spoke Germanic languages and they were primarily pagan. So, usually they had a number of gods. So kind of like you think of Norse mythology with Odin and Thor and Loki and some of the, but not a large number of gods, but some gods. And each of the nomadic tribes had a god system that was usually polytheistic, but they really didn't have any structure that was overwhelmingly religious. And so they sacked Rome, and the Roman Empire itself no longer had that kind of dominant governance. And yet when they moved back, as they were going to, because they were nomadic, they moved back north with Catholicism. And so in some ways, they are the reason why Catholicism spread throughout Europe. But because of Islam taking over much of northern Africa and the Middle East, that effectively cut off Europe from Asia and the rest of Africa too. So the pagan societies in lower Africa remained pretty much distinct and separate from Europeans. But even the Islam and the Islamic countries would become quite separate from Europeans because of the religion barrier. In case you're wondering whether it's a new thing that the Middle East is filled with fighting and people, Palestinians and Israelis and Christians are all fighting around. This is a long-standing feud, and it's been one really. There's been an issue between Christians and Jews since Christianity began, and that's the same for Islam. Even though they're all tied together in some ways, it's rather like when a church, they have a falling out of the congregation and some of the, part of the congregation moves and starts a new church. Often these two bodies become quite antagonistic toward each other. And that sort of is what happens. In fact, even the Holy Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern or Greek Orthodox Church have a lot of fighting amongst themselves. And they didn't have that many differences. And yet those differences actually led the Holy Roman Catholic Church during the Crusades to attack the Eastern Orthodox congregations as well as Islam, Judaism, Gnosticism, and a bunch of other heretical views. So it's going to create a barrier because it by its very dominance over society, it's going to require that society remain pretty much separate from other societies. But we'll see how that works as we go along. And actually, that's going to continue all the way through into the Renaissance until we get to the Protestant Reformation, where things will change a lot. But we'll get there eventually. In this chapter, though, mostly we're going to be talking about feudalism, castles, medieval structure, social structure, as well as townships. And we're going to look at a lot of the architecture of castles and cathedrals. So that'll be fun. But let's talk a little bit, kind of go from 476 when Rome falls and look at what essentially happens. Now, these Germanic tribes are not from Germany. And I covered that at the end of the lecture in chapter 4. Well, no, chapter 3. But they speak Germanic languages. And I'm going to switch just a second so that you can see this. This is actually in your chapter as well, the language groups. And they say, you know, the Roman languages, they actually call it these are Latinate languages, or the Latin group of languages, because they all kind of stem from Latin. The Roman languages are the third little arrow, so it's kind of on the left-hand side near the bottom. Those Roman languages, those are all essentially what happens to a language is over time, any language changes. And over centuries and centuries, it changes a lot. And that's something we will cover quite a bit today, you know, actually in this session. So Latin really isn't dead. You know, a lot of people call it a dead language. Now, Old Latin, or the Latin that was used during the Roman era, is dead. It is not a language that any child is born and raised speaking as their first language. It is a language that we study mainly so that we can read the Roman texts, and we can, you know, especially for people who are practicing Catholics, especially Roman Catholics, they are more likely to learn Latin and read the Bible in the Latin original. But today, very few of us would read the Bible in Latin. And many scholars, if they're going to study the Bible, would actually study it. They would learn Hebrew to study the Old Testament, and then they learn Greek to study the New Testament. But at this time, remember, the Holy Roman Catholic Church created the Bible, translated it completely into Latin. It chose what books were going to go at the Council of Nicaea, and then it translated all of those books into Latin, and then required that those books not be translated into any other language for about a millennium. So 1,000 years of you can't translate the Bible into any other language, even though really within a few hundred years, nobody is speaking Latin anymore. Latin becomes, over time, it transforms depending on where it is geographically into other languages. That's why if you learn Spanish, it's actually pretty easy to learn Italian, because they're very similar in languages, because they both stem from Latin. At the same time, if you listen to Portuguese or read Portuguese, it is a kind of a mixture of French sounds and Italian and Spanish sounds, and French is also related. So all of them, you can find words that literally can be found in some little slightly different format in all of these languages, because they all stem from the Latin original. Our language is actually Germanic. And so if you look at the very far left bottom, you're going to see English, and that's our stems from German. The Old German has become, or very quickly becomes, English, Dutch, German, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish. I mean, look at this. There's a whole lot. Afrikaans is actually an African language, but it stems from Dutch, and it's a mixture. It's kind of like Gullah, or, I mean, there are a lot of that are kind of like mixtures of vocabulary and language patterns from different languages. And that's because the Dutch settled in once they began colonization, they settled in southern Africa and kind of dominated society for quite some time there. And so it's a mixture of some different things, but then this even includes Icelandic. And so, you know, any of the Northern European languages, almost all of those are going to be Germanic, with the exception of the Celtic group, which you'll see at the bottom. It is not Celtic, please get it right. The Boston Celtics should be the Boston Celtics. And it's one of those weird things that bothers me, but I'll get over it. But that includes several different kinds of Gaelic. It includes Welsh, which is still spoken today. That's spoken in Wales. And yet most Welsh speak both Welsh and English. Same with the Gaelics. Most of the people who speak Gaelic today, although those two languages are sort of dying out, they speak both Gaelic and English, and often they speak other languages as well. Same with Cornish, that's from Cornwall. All of these are kind of Breton languages, so they're all up in the British Isles. Manx is actually not only the name of a cat, but both language and the cat stem from the Isle of Man, and that's off the British coast. So just so you know, but we're going to be mainly dealing with the Germanic languages and then the Latin or Roman languages. So they're all going to come from that source. In fact, we're going to get to a point in feudalism when William the Conqueror from France, well, from Normandy, northern France, will attack and conquer England and make essentially king of France and England. But he will also only speak French and Latin. And so he will require, essentially, he'll make it where the national language of England is French. The only problem is nobody except the court speaks French. So English doesn't die out. It actually survives, and eventually the two kingships get separated again. And so there's a king of England and then a king of France. So, but we almost, I mean, if had that not happened, we would today, I'd be giving this lecture in French. And English might very well have died out completely and be one of those lost languages. But that's not what happened. So we still speak English. And French is a beautiful language, but I'm still very happy speaking the English that I was raised with. So that's just a little bit of a language lesson. Now, with that, though, of course, here are all these Germanic peoples. They come down, get into to kind of conquer parts of the Roman Empire. And what they eventually do is there becomes this sort of mixture of culture. They take with them back up north into Europe. They take the Holy Roman Catholic church teaching, so that Christianity gets spread northward through these tribes. They actually, and part of it is because they have copies of the Bible, but there aren't that many copies because they're handwritten, and yet they managed to take a lot of the sensibility, and it helps that a lot of priests go north with them, and these priests actually, they're some of the reasons why we, for instance, celebrate Easter in late March or early April. And that's because Easter, if you look at Easter and its symbology, most of its symbology is pagan. So we have Easter egg hunts. Well, eggs are symbolizing, kind of like the Earth Mother Goddess, they're symbolizing productivity and breeding, having babies. And so do Easter bunnies. We think, they have babies like rabbits. Well, that's a long-standing traditional view of rabbits, that they can procreate and have tons of babies. And so that's also a symbol of that springtime proclivity. And so what happened was a lot of the priests would come and they'd take their religious symbology and they would meld it with the pagan. And so that's why I even knew a Christian, a private school in Bainbridge that celebrated Winterfest right before Christmas every year. Well, Winterfest was one of the pagan holidays that coincided with the end of fall and the beginning of that long haul of winter in the cold. And so the priests put, it helped too that December 25th was kind of floating around as Mithra's birthday, but it was very easy for them to essentially say, well, let's make this Christ celebration. And so the Yule, which was a pagan holiday, was aligned with Christmas, and it became Christ's holiday, but in reality it was originally a pagan one. So it's funny because and even the fact that we decorate a Christmas tree, that's actually a Norse mythology issue. The fir trees were in honor of the god Thor, as was the laying of fir, the fir branches along the mantle, and as the greenery, the hanging of the greens, that is also a traditionally Thor centered activity. So much of what we even do there in both Christmas and Easter, which are probably, some people could argue the most prevalent Christian holidays today, they're both very much deeply rooted in pagan practices. And probably the main reason that happened is because of this, that all these pagan groups went north, taking Christianity with them, but adapting it to their pagan pastimes and sensibilities. So it's amazing how much, just human movement can affect how we practice things today. But I know I actually put up several trees every year, and my husband decorates outside, And yet it's much of those practices are very much not Christian, but pagan originally. So in fact, probably the most Christian holiday we have, truly Christian, truly religiously based, is Halloween, because it is All Hallows Eve or All Saints Eve, and that is before November 1st, which is a Catholic holiday called All Saints Day. So there's not a pagan ceremony that or holiday that typically falls around the end of that we kind of added stuff to. There are some Celtic holidays that are around the same time, but they are really not, even what the practices are, the activities don't really coincide. The use of costumes and jack-o'-lanterns, all of those things are actually religious traditions. Those are Catholic traditions. So it's not a pagan holiday, which is, not what we normally think, but that's true. It's just what it is. Now, what's interesting though is because of there's also a melding of communal structure. So these nomadic tribes were wandering, and so they often encountered each other. Often these encounters could involve conflict or war. And so it was, warrior mentality was definitely a part of much of this, because having a good warrior or set of warriors who could fight off a neighboring tribe could make it so that you could defend yourself and survive as a tribe. If the warriors didn't fight well, then you died out. You got killed. You got slaughtered by another tribe whose warriors fought better. And so essentially the core group of a nomadic tribe was that there would be some sort of leader, lord, a laird, if you want to think about it in the Gaelic. But that leader would need trustworthy and loyal warriors to serve him. And then those warriors, in return for their fealty, for their allegiance, would get rewarded by the Lord. So that if they sacked another town or another tribe or something like that, then they would get all this, they get the spoils of war, but then the leader would mete out those spoils and give them. It's kind of like when, if we go back to the Iliad, when Achilles, at the very beginning of the Iliad, Achilles is made angry because Agamemnon passed out a bunch of gifts to his warriors. He was the general in charge. And then when he got mad about something, he took back Achilles' prize, who was actually a slave, Briseis. And so that angered Achilles, and he refused to fight in the war, at least for a time. But that's the thing, is it requires the absolute fealty of the warriors, that they remain absolutely loyal to the king. But in return, that king or lord or leader needed to be generous. If the leader was not, if he held back and kept, hoarded stuff for himself and didn't give out rewards to his warriors, he was going to be supplanted. The warriors were not going to put up with that, and he would not remain the leader. So that's the core kind of tribal mentality. And you can probably see it most closely it's probably it lasted the longest in things like the clan system in Scotland, where every year all the members of the clan would have to swear fealty to whoever the head of the clan was. But in return, and they'd even pay taxes to the laird, but then the laird would reward them with different things. They'd give them plots of land to work on and grow crops, but they would help them out. So it was kind of a you give me and I give you kind of reciprocating thing. But if you were disloyal to a clan or to a tribal community, usually your punishment was exile. If they didn't kill you outright, they sent you away from the clan. And you think, okay, well, what's the big deal? It was actually a huge deal, because you did not belong to any other community. If you were kicked out of one tribal community, your chances of surviving on your own were slim to none. And your chances of being adopted by another clan, no, that was less likely, because other clans wouldn't trust you. You didn't grow up with them. They don't have a history with you. So they might kill you outright if you come and invade their territory. So it was a very scary thing to not belong to a clan. And this clan mentality, this tribal loyalty, would essentially have Christianity transposed over it. And so it became like, this is where we get the idea of the divine right of kings, that a king is born, of his dad who was king, and that the oldest son of whatever ruler it is, that person is given the right by God to rule over all the people around him, that's actually determined by God and not just by, random genetics or birth order or something like that. And it's still the basis for what actual kingships exist today. Now, most of the kings today aren't as powerful as they used to be. So even in England, like they just had Queen Elizabeth, after many, 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 many years reign, finally passed away. Her son took over. He just was coronated. I mean, he was just crowned like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. And this, of course, that'll be later if you're watching this in a later class. But when he was crowned king, think, okay, wow, that suddenly he has power. He actually doesn't have any power. He's really just a figurehead. But he does have a lot of money that goes with his status, and he is a public figure who does represent both the country, and he is the head of the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and that continues from the time of Henry VIII, because he started the Anglican Church, as we'll get to later. But that, again, though, it's this idea of a person being anointed as the head of something, and that comes from this early feudalism, and it's actually a mixture of the Holy Roman Catholic Church and that pagan tribal loyalty, that the leader's supposed to be the leader. He's born to be the leader, and he's supposed to lead, and your job, if you're under him, is to swear loyalty and serve him, even if he's not great. But he's supposed to be great. He's supposed to be generous and kind in return and help the people around him out. The other thing that's really important is the Germanic tribes were almost completely, it would only be a little bit later that they would actually develop systems of writing. So most of them did not, they had only oral languages when they sacked Rome. Probably within the next few hundred years, all of them will end up, well, Gaelic to a less degree, but most of them will end up with some type of written language, and the writing will be based on the Latin alphabet. So even though they are not a Latin language, most of their lettering is Latin letters. We're used to, like, all of these letters that you're seeing right here on this page, they're all from Latin. They're not Greek. And that's because, again, of the influence of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. So remember, the Holy Roman Catholic Church had the Bible as its basis in Latin. In fact, services for the next 1,000 years or so would all occur in Latin. All music, all of the mass that was sung by choirs would all be in Latin. The service itself was almost entirely in Latin. So imagine going to church, and instead of church being in English, you go to church and you spend an hour or an hour and a half there, and it's all in a different language. And that's pretty much what people, went through, because as it went forward, the Latin still became the standard language of the church. And so, and you were, in most places, you were pretty much required to go. And so you go to church, but it wouldn't even be in a language you understood. And very few people at this time could read. The vast majority of those who were literate were clergy, those who were, of course, priests and monks and friars, but were actual leaders in the church. Nuns, that included women, so nuns could also be literate. In fact, some of them were scribes once they, became nuns. But the vast majority of the regular population, the non-clergy, could not read at all. They couldn't write their own name. They had no books, and so they had no access really to books. The very upper class, so like some royal figures, some of the nobility might have tutors or might go and study at a monastery, which we'll talk about, but some of them were completely illiterate too. And so very few people within the population could read or had access to learn to read. And the vast majority were either clerical, they were clergy, or they were very, very upper class. And that's really feudalism too. So we'll talk about all of that too. Now, in a monastery was originally a kind of a little enclosure or encampment that was created as the church moved north. So they would settle, enough priests would get together and they'd send for more, and the church would supply them with building materials and money to build some type of monastic structure. Sometimes there was a church attached to it, sometimes there was not. Either way, the monastery itself was supposed to be It mainly contained residents that were priests or scribes, well, or scribes, and monks and friars and people who were ordained. Or it could be a convent filled with nuns, women. Um, but they were supposed to be self-sufficient. So they would establish themselves, growing crops and often making wine or beer or ale and selling it, or, they'd set themselves up essentially so that they could provide some food to the public or even shelter. This was like the only hotels that existed early on, is you'd go from monastery to monastery and pay for a little bit, or even for free, they'd house you for the night and then you'd go on. You could also go and you could, if you really wanted to learn, but you didn't want to be a priest, you could go and study at a monastery. They would teach you to read, they'd teach you mathematics and religion, but a large number of the people who would go and study there, they were all nobility, but many of them became priests or ordained themselves. So it was definitely, it was a self-sufficient, they kind of raised their own money and raised their own food, but they also did serve the community. And they were the ones too who would, if they were poor, then the poor could come and get food. They could get some alms, and so that they could afford their own stuff. That babies were abandoned there to be taken in and cared for. So a lot of that kind of stuff was they were kind of like little charities as well. So they performed a service for the community, and so they were very esteemed highly by pretty much everybody, both as a source of education and as a source for help if somebody was in need. They definitely lived, even though they lived to themselves, they were definitely part of the communities where they were created. And they also ran hospitals and schools. Usually the schools only went so high, so and they were not free, and so still the vast majority of children didn't go to school. Only some did. But you could certainly, if you were wealthy enough, your parents could send you to a monastery to study for several years, and you could learn a lot of the stuff that they learned. Sometimes you would become a priest, sometimes you were already intended to be married to somebody. A lot of young women would be sent to a convent, mainly to keep them from becoming too worldly, and then they'd be released at 15, 16, 17 years old, back to the family, and then they'd be married. Often they were they were arranged to be married, especially if they were upper class, when they were barely born, and they just waited kind of until she was old enough, they deemed old enough to get married. So that was, and she didn't really have much of a choice, though a lot of women became nuns because they instead of taking their dowry and giving it to their husband, they took their dowry and gave it to the church, and then were allowed to be nuns instead. And that meant they didn't have to go through with a marriage they didn't want. So there was, a little bit of an out for women too. Now, the vast majority of illuminated manuscripts written at this time were written by priests and nuns and scribes, but they were all of the religious order. Remember, those are the people who were literate anyway. And they weren't like typical manuscripts. So I'm going to show you one example. You can see the illuminated manuscript over on the right-hand side. And the thing on the left-hand side is actually a buckle for a belt. And we don't have the belt anymore. The leather's long ago deteriorated, but this is a Celtic buckle. So you can see some of the Celtic designs. These are from the Germanic tribes. They're quite beautiful. And they're actually, this is inlaid. So this was gold, and then it was inlaid with either some type of dye or with little stones. That was very common at the time. But you can see some of those same patterns are coming out in the illumination on the manuscript on the right-hand side too. Now, manuscripts were not written on paper. They were written on vellum or parchment. And the only difference between the two is one is goat skin and one is sheepskin. But those were prepared and stretched and thinned out, and it was a very arduous process. And then they were cut into sheets. And then the scribe would hand draw and hand letter the text onto the sheet of vellum. And so, one page like this could take a day or two. It could even take as long as a week, depending on what colors are used and how painstaking the colorations were. And then they would slowly put, stack by stack by stack, they put all these pages together, and then they would bind them into a book. To copy to copy the entire Bible, so the Old and New Testament together, first of all, the book would be massive and very thick, because vellum was not, it is thin, but it's not like paper is. And some of you, if you've ever seen a Bible and actually opened it up, it is, even with very, very, super thin paper, it is very dense and very thick. Well, imagine it handwritten, and one scribe could literally take a year or more to copy the Bible a single time. Many scribes working on a single book could still take months. So Bibles and other books were extremely expensive. These are books none like us regular ordinary people could never afford. Equivalently, it would probably cost more than my yearly salary, to buy a single book like this. So it was extremely rare. Often churches did not even own one copy. And if there was one copy, there was only one, because they were just too expensive. But, the larger churches definitely would, they pride themselves on whatever copy they had. They wanted the illuminated manuscripts like this because those were the ones that looked the most beautiful. So if someone were to thumb through it, and they go, oh, wow, that's just a fantastically beautiful manuscript. Here are some other examples too. This is the one on the very far, actually the two slides on the middle and the far right are both from the book of Kells. And then the Lindisfarne Gospel is the one on the left. And you can see that entire page is just an illustration. Now, these are all in Latin. You'll notice too that they are not easy to read. Early manuscripts didn't have any regularized kind of standard script, and they often ran together, and different scribes had different handwriting in the same way that we do. And so sometimes they're pretty hard to translate. But they were all written in Latin. Remember, that was still the language of the Bible and of most scholars. And so even if you didn't speak Latin, when you learn to read, you would most likely learn to read at least Latin, and maybe only Latin. And you wouldn't even learn to read your own language. Remember too, a lot of those languages were still oral. They didn't have a written form yet, though they would get them soon. One of the earliest texts that we have that was not in Latin, but was in English, and you're going to look at this and go, English, that's not English. And it's really not. But one of those, essentially, it's an epic poem, and it's a poem, just like the Iliad and the Odyssey and Gilgamesh. It was just like those as well. It was written. It was originally oral, and so it was passed along. Most likely, estimates are for at least 300 or 400 years before it was written down. Around 1000 CE, it was most likely copied down or translated down, or in English. This is Old English, by scribes. So these were religious scholars, but they were not the ones who had over the centuries passed it down orally. Those would have been professional poets or bards, and the bards would have gone to a feast or to a festival or something, and out loud they would have recited this poem over the course of probably several nights. It's a very long poem. It's not as long as the Iliad and the Odyssey, but it's still pretty long. But they would have memorized the entire thing. And these bards would not necessarily know how to read. They would have memorized based upon listening to another bard. So one bard would have taught another bard the entire poem. So how much has it changed over the years? We have no idea. Absolutely no idea, because we only have a few copies left. Most of them were destroyed over time. Henry VIII actually destroyed several of them himself, unfortunately. But they are and we don't have any that are completely intact. So there are some with pages. You can see how dilapidated this one page is, and it's a reflection of how much damage just happens to these things over time. Though this was written on vellum, So let me take it for a second. I'm not going to use that particular thing, that what's listed there, but I'm going to use some of those words. I'm just going to get my copy for a second. So you know I'm a nerd because I said I was. I always make it very clear to people that I'm an absolute nerd. And so I took two classes in Old English, and one of them we spent the entire semester translating Beowulf from Old English into modern English. And so it's one of my fun things. I love languages, so it's pretty easy to do. And what I'm going to do is go to. I'm just going to start. It's really probably about the third line up there. I might start from the beginning, but I'm just going to let you listen to how it sounds, because it is, and you can find at least partial renditions of this in on YouTube. Some of them are better than others, but I kind of like, yeah. So we'll start with the beginning, and that's actually the H. It's an H, and then the P up at the top of this torn page is a P. It looks like a P, but it actually is like a sound. So like thank you or something like that. And then the AE is an A sound. So and unfortunately, it's all kind of, you're not going to hear all of the sounds. And that sound can also be a W sound depending on when it was written and where it was written. So some of the pronunciation is a lot of our pronunciation has changed, and you're going to hear that just in the vowels themselves. So you can in your journal, even you can write to me and say, okay, this is what it sounded like to me, this Beowulf thing. So this is what it sounds like. What we gardena in gerdagum, theod kuninge thrim gefrunan, fu for athelingus ellen fremden, oft shield chafing, shathena tratum, monogam magtum, megdola setla oftea, exera erlas, sithaneris werth, feshaft funden, he thas frufre gebade, werks onder wochnum, werth mundum fa, othat hem agwilche fair, im sitindra, ofer honrad, Hira shoulder, Gomben Gilden, that was God Kooning. Okay, so that last part you might have gotten a little bit. Right? It's actually smack dab in the middle of the page. It says Silthan, and then it says that, and you kind of added in there was God Kooning, and all that means is that was a good king. That was God Kooning. And so, after a while, you're thinking, what does that even sound like? It sounds like German, because English is a Germanic language. One reason we sound so different today is because of our access to and exposure to Latinate languages. English is one of the most acquisitive languages. We acquire a lot of words all the time. Our vocabulary in English is just ginormous compared to most other languages. Because oh, that's a cool word. Oh, that's a cool word. Oh, that's a cool word. Even when we moved to America, so many of the native sounds and words became part of our vocabulary. And so it's just the way it is. We like different languages, but we because of our exposure to it, we've had a lot of we have what is called the great vowel shift. So God becomes good. Even like dog becomes dog. So, but we have a lot of those kinds of shifts all the way through. Weath becomes wife. So it's just one of those things. And ston becomes stone. And I could give you a billion examples, but that's just how Old English works. Now, what's cool about this is not just the fact that we have copies of it at all, because that's honestly astonishing. Again, English was not widely read. And so the only reason we have these copies in Old English is because those scholars, whoever they were, they're anonymous, we don't know, knew both, they could read and write, but they also knew Old English. Had they only known Latin, there's no way they could have transcribed this and written it down. So thank goodness they knew both Old English and Latin. Otherwise, we wouldn't have these texts today, and we wouldn't know anything about them. There are other texts too. I've read one that was in Icelandic, and it's called Greta Saga. And then there's Nils Saga, and that's in Norwegian. But there are several. I mean, a lot of these different Germanic tribes have surviving documents that have, usually they're epic poems about some big tough hero, not a not a god. You know, he doesn't have necessarily, you know, supernatural powers, but they're so sort of supernatural. He's more like Achilles, you know, where he's super strong, or he has abilities that normal men just can't do. And Beowulf is like that. He's also, and this tale is also a really good example of tribal fealty and the rules that kind of govern and define what a warrior should be, what a king should be, how warriors serve their kings, and what makes a warrior good or bad. And so Beowulf is, in even his name, some people, some of the scholars translate it as Beowulf, like he's like, you know, I don't know, like stinging like a bee or something. Some call him Beowulf, and some think that Beo is actually some sort of um, form of man. So he's almost like a werewolf, like a man wolf. I don't think there's nothing in the text that describes him as being wolf-like. I think it's just that he's super strong. So bear wolf actually works best for me in my what I've studied. Either way, he's a super strong dude who has abilities that most men can't, and he's super brave. And that's probably the biggest thing. He's willing to try things that other guys just won't try. So essentially what happens in Beowulf is that there two adventures happen in one place, and then one adventure happens when Beowulf is much older. But Beowulf is a thane. He is a warrior who serves his king. Now his king is not the king of, this actually happens, the first two episodes happen in the land of the Danes. So you think Danish king. And Danish is one of the Germanic languages, so it all fits. His name is Hrothgar with an H. And Hrothgar built this beautiful mead hall so that he could serve mead to all of his warriors and people of his kingdom. And a mead hall, a mead is like, it's fermented honey. So it's kind of like a very sweet white wine. That's as close as I can describe it. It was very common among Germanic tribes because it was easy. I mean, they had access to honey, and it was very easy. It's a very easy drink to make. And so that's what you don't drink the water, because the water is going to be, you know, nasty and make you sick. So people drank wine, and people drank ale, and people drank mead. So he builds this big mead hall, and they get, you know, every night they feast and get drunk. And there's a monster named Grendel who finds the noise irritating. And so after a few nights of Hrothgar and his people partying, he goes into the mead hall after everybody's fallen asleep, and he eats a bunch of soldiers, bones and all. Just swallows them or chews on them or whatever. It's ghastly. And then he runs away. Well, the next morning they wake up and they go, "Oh my gosh, what's all this blood?" You know, it's a really gory kind of thing. And I do not suggest Beowulf the movie. The first half actually fits the book, and the other half makes no sense. So don't use it instead of trying to read Beowulf. It's better. I read Beowulf, a translation of Beowulf, when I think I was an 8th grader. So they're very accessible translations out there that are really fascinating to read. I strongly suggest this. It's fun. It's right along the lines of the Iliad and the Odyssey for me. But then, so there's this big Grendel monster that eats people, rather like the Minotaur or something. And the soldiers, you know, when he comes again the next night, the soldiers try to fight him, but their swords don't do any good. They can't kill him. And he eats a bunch of people and runs away again. And so Hrothgar, after several nights of this, says, we can't do this anymore. He closes the hall, and everybody hides shivering in their houses. If anybody's caught out at night, Grendel eats them. So it's a bad place to live all of a sudden. And Hrothgar doesn't know what to do. His warriors can't fight this beast off. Well, here comes Beowulf, and he's actually sent by his own king. He is a Geat. It's spelled Geat, but he is a Geat, and he has been sent by his king to serve Hrothgar, which is not typical. But he's been sent because Hrothgar's own people aren't defending the kingdom the way they're supposed to. They're not good warriors. So Beowulf's he's going to show them up in a way. And so that night he promises, I'm going to face Grendel, and I'm not even going to use a weapon. I'm just going to fight him with my bare hands. So he does. And he doesn't drink while everybody else gets drunk and stuff. He doesn't do that. He waits for Grendel. Grendel comes over, eats one soldier, then walks to the next one, who's Beowulf. Beowulf grabs him and rips his arm off. And Grendel runs away off into the forest to bleed to death. They take the arm and they stick it up, and they actually nail it up onto the cross beams inside the hall as a trophy. Well, then everybody's super happy. Yay, we beat him. But then Grendel's mom is upset because her son comes home to die, and she's furious that somebody killed her son. So she comes to the hall that night. She eats one soldier immediately, and then takes another one and drags him off. And they follow the blood trail to a river. I mean, to a big lake. And Beowulf dives into the lake, swims for a whole day. This is how I know it's a little bit off, it's a little bit on the wonky side, but he swims all day long to get to the cave under the water where Grendel and his mom lived. And he finds Grendel's mom. He can't stab her with his sword. It won't work. It actually, like, the acid, like, sizzles all over it and eats it. But he finds a goblin sword and he swacks her with the goblin sword and cuts her head off. And then he brings back the trophy. He actually takes her head and brings it back. And then they know, okay, these monsters are all gone. And he's successful. Then he goes home back to Gateland. And then, because he's such a brave, fantastic warrior, he becomes king. And then at the end of his life, 50 years after the stuff with Grendel, so he's got to be like 70, 75 years old, a dragon is awakened from his hoard. So if you've ever seen like the Hobbit movies, and you think about Smaug and the fact that one little thing out of place can wake him up from his nap over his hoard of treasure, that's very much from Beowulf. In fact, Tolkien was a medieval scholar, so he absolutely drew upon these medieval patterns for his stories, and with Lord of the Rings as well. But so Beowulf is an old man now, but his warriors are all scared to death of the dragon. The dragon's now flying around all mad because some guy came in, and a thief came in and took some of his treasure and stomped off. Well, he's mad. He wants his treasure back, and he starts burning all the houses in the kingdom down. Beowulf knows that they got to do something about the dragon. And so he's going into where the dragon's hoard is, and he's going to fight the dragon inside his own, that building, that cave. And none of his soldiers will go with him. He tells them not to. Don't worry, I'll go do it. But he really shouldn't. This is where fealty kind of drops. He should have had his warriors go in and fight. Instead, he goes in alone at the age of 70 something. And one other of his name's Wiglaf. He actually chastises the soldiers, and he runs in after Beowulf to help him. But Beowulf does end up stabbing the dragon. He kills him, but he also gets bitten in the neck by the dragon's fang, which is poisonous. So this kind of goes with, like even Harry Potter draws on some of this stuff. But because of that, he's going to die. And so the very last thing he does is he essentially appoints Wiglaf his successor, and he asks him to take him where he can see the treasure from the dragon. And so he can look on what the spoils of war, I guess, brought in. And it does matter. Those kinds of spoils matter to a lot of these warriors. They're fighting for that treasure. So it's an interesting story. It's really fascinating to read. I strongly recommend it. And it's in Old English. So this is English. When you say, oh, well, Shakespeare's hard to read because it's in Old English. No, it's actually early modern English. It's not even Middle English, which we'll get to in the next chapter. But this was written by scholars in a monastery who were scribes, who were religious scribes. Now, women actually did have an option of being a scribe as well. Women did not have much of a role in the church itself. A lot of it was from just the patriarchal system that was, typical, but many used stories. I mean, the Old Testament is based on the, the Jewish community, which is also very patriarchal. And so women had very little power and very little prestige within that community as well. Many women, I mean, hardly any women are even mentioned, honestly, in the Old Testament. They're far more male characters than female. And essentially what the culture at large, what this new Christian group that under Catholicism used Eve's story, the fact that she was tempted before Adam and then even tempted Adam, as certainly a statement about women in general and their abilities. But it also, there was, Mary was a subservient person. She didn't act, she was acted upon. And so women did not have roles of leadership. Even within a convent, there would be a mother abbess, but if priests were to come and visit, they were supervisors over the mother abbess, and no women could have any precedence or prestige over or rank above men. So if a man came into the situation, the man was automatically in charge in a church situation. So in outside the church, women were not allowed to own property. In fact, in England, they couldn't own property until like 1900. And then 1902, they finally got the vote, but they couldn't vote because you couldn't vote unless you owned property. And women legally couldn't own property. So that was typical. Women were definitely believed to be weak against temptation. Not that they were inherently super sinful, but they were easily tempted themselves, and they tempted men to stray. So they were especially sexually tempting, and that's a problem. Actually, even within Islam and in a lot of Arabic communities, that's deemed the way that it is. And that's one reason why women are required to cover themselves. They are too much or wear loose clothing or even cover their faces, because that they are a temptation just by existing to the male leadership. And that's actually a very long-standing belief by a lot of different, especially really, really conservative communities. So like in Afghanistan, where women are required to be completely covered from head to toe. So other places in the Middle East are a little less so, but Islam, when Muhammad actually began Islam, he tried to lessen the forbidding against women. He tried to make it easier on women and children and give them more power. But the truth is they had really none at that point. They don't have a lot even now in medieval Europe, but they could become nuns. They could make that choice even without their parents' support. Like they could flee to a convent to avoid a marriage or something like that, and the church would allow them to do so even if their parents came to come get them. The church would say, no, she chose to be, to give her life to Christ, and that they would end it there. And they could learn to read. That was the number one way to learn to read, is to go and become a nun. So you could get trained in a monastery. And there were women who wrote usually in Latin. Hildegard of Bingen does write. She was in a German monastery, but her writings and plays were all in Latin. But she was widely read by the clergy, by male clergy. So she was definitely a respected part of the system, even though she really didn't have the same status that a man might have. So it's kind of a mixed bag. But in general, women did not have any leadership roles in the church at all. Like in a church service, they couldn't sing in the choir. They could never join the priesthood. They could never be a minister. None of that was allowed. And still isn't, actually. Catholic priests have to be men. So, but the monastic system was, again, that's the source of all texts and all learning. There were no universities at this time or public schools or any of that kind of stuff. And under Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, he was French. That was his French name. He tried to start. He declared himself, and the Pope helped, declared himself the Holy Roman Emperor, and he's really the emperor over what he hoped would become the new Roman Empire. It never really happened. So he tried to put it all together again, the Roman Empire. He did not manage to get much of the land that he wanted to from Islamic lands, so like Spain and Portugal and things like that. But he did manage to create some unity within his kingdom until he died. And then the empire kind of fell apart. It's kind of like Alexander the Great. He amassed a large territory, but then he died and it fell apart. So the same thing kind of happened with Charlemagne. But he believed in education. And so he set up schools throughout the empire, and they were almost all based in either churches, like at parochial schools, or based within the monastic system itself. So you could go almost like it's a little university. You can go and take several years, pay so much money to the monastery, and then get training in all sorts of subjects. So and he regularized the script system. So you can see the script system when it was all caps, that Latin over on the left-hand side, and he made it far more regular. And that actually looks like Old English, the old English script, but that was far easier to read than the first script. And he actually had people trained. They had to develop the script first, and it's also easier to write. And then the scribes had to be trained in it. So all the work from his time on was in that same script, and it became far easier for scholars to read, far easier for it to be passed from place to place and be accessible. And eventually, when things would be written in the vernacular or in the common languages like German and English and French, they would be written in the same script, at least for a while. Now, from Charlemagne comes another epic, a religious epic, and we don't know the author, but it's about a man named Roland, and it's actually based on a real event. Roland was Charlemagne, or Charles the Great's nephew, and they were fighting. They called them inside the epic itself, they call them Saracens, and that's actually a word that's used a lot, but it's a word that stands for Muslims. It's just a more medieval word they used. And Roland was in the army, the Christian army, fighting the Muslim army. And there were a series of battles during Charlemagne's lifetime. His father, Charlemagne's, well, I think he was his brother, but Ganelon was actually a general, and he actually gave secrets to the Muslims about their location and the movements and where they were going to be heading next and when they'd arrive at certain places. And so they were going through a pass that was pretty narrow, and Ganelon helped the Muslim soldiers, who were already double the number of the Christian soldiers. He helped them essentially ambush the army, and Charlemagne's army. And Roland fought and fought and fought and fought to the death. He was killed in the fighting that his own father had instigated, essentially. And then after Roland dies, a hero, Ganelon is actually put to death for treason. They discover that he's the one who gave the secrets away. Not only did he essentially cause the death of his own son, but then he was put to death himself. But this story was passed down for several, because Charlemagne lived around the mid 6th century. And so about 500 years later, well, 450 years later, it was written in Old French and recorded, and it's quite beautiful. It's a real long poem, and the battle takes forever. But what it did do is it had that same heroism element, certainly the war, like with the Iliad and the Odyssey, but this is the first time that the hero was a Christian. And so it melded that Holy Roman Catholicism with the epic tradition in a pretty interesting way. And this will happen again a lot, actually, towards the end of the medieval period, when we have Arthurian literature based on King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. Those will all be Christian knights, pretty much. And those knights will go on adventures. They'll find the Holy Grail and, do all those defend women and get tested over and over again. But these are primarily, with Christian ideas in mind. So this is the beginning of that melding of those ideas. Now, in feudalism is a system that really only it benefits the king and the nobles more than anybody else. So we have the king, who's at the top of the system, and you can see the little pyramid I put there, and then his lords, the nobles underneath him, each own little fiefs of land. They're like fiefdoms, and they're awarded that land based upon their loyalty to the king and how they serve him. And then they have knights or vassals, and those knights are supposed to, originally it's set down they're supposed to serve him for 40 days a year, so like a month and a half. It's almost like the army reserve or something, and they serve him for that many days a year, and then they get smaller pieces of land within the fiefdom that the noble has, the lord. And then underneath them, they all own this land, and then the land is separated into tinier plots or acres, and each acre is essentially has a serf on it, and that serf lives on that land. It was born there, raises, essentially tills that same acre of land. An acre is supposed to be the size of a plot of land that one person can essentially till and create, use it to create food. And so that's how we develop that measurement. And then the peasant grows his crop, the person who's a serf on the land. He doesn't own it. It's still it belongs to the knight or to the lord, but then he has a crop, and then he pays a percentage of that crop back to the person who actually owns the land. And it's like a tax. And the rest of it he uses to feed his family and to trade with other farmers, and to make it so that he can make a living enough to survive. It is an extremely poor existence. So the vast majority, when we're talking about the vassals and the nobles and the king, the very top 3 tiers of this society I'm showing you, that is literally 10% of the society. So the other 90% are peasants and serfs, and that's all. So they're not the ones who really benefit from this kind of a system. The only people who did were the knights and nobles and the king. It is highly likely that the king was literate, at least to some degree. The nobles, at least there was a good possibility that they were. The knights, some, but the peasants pretty much, they were going to be completely illiterate. And they were abjectly poor. This is not a system where the vast majority had, led pretty good lives. No, the vast majority led really lives of utter poverty and bare subsistence. So they would barely not starve. And if they, if a poor man had like 5 daughters, boy, he was in a mess, because he didn't even have another man to help him till. So they would have to work in the fields. A lot of the women, the wives of these serfs, would work in the fields as well. And so it was a family endeavor to subsist, just to not starve to death. So it's not, I don't want to glamorize feudalism and make it to be this, wonderful thing. Now, obviously, if the king found one of his nobles was not loyal, then that person would usually be stripped of his title, his land, and he might even be put to death. He was at least going to be exiled. He was going to be thrown out of the area. But he very well could be put to death. Often, though, if he was put to death, all of his family members would be kicked off the land, and then they would be in trouble. They'd fall from the very, top tiers down to the bottom, because they'd have unless they had some family member who could help them. So it was really a precarious existence especially if you were found to be disloyal, which did happen historically. Castles were the key to this feudal society, though. So each lord, if he had his fiefdom, his kingdom, his little, the land around his that he owned because it was gifted by the king. Well, to protect that, he needed something. And usually, at first they built like little wood castles, but very quickly they started building castles out of stone, brick, or cement. And it was mostly because the risk of fire was far lesser. And usually what happened is inside the castle, they would have one big area. It was a big kind of living space, and it would have not only the castle, like the big dining hall, where, you could serve 100 people at once, but it also had a lot of guest rooms, and then of course the room for the laird and his wife and their kids and stuff like that. And it also contained what they call the castle keep. And this is where they stored all those taxes. Think about all the food that was done, that portion of whatever the serf grew was given to the lord. And then he would store all of that food inside the castle. Now, if an army came and attacked the fiefdom, all the people inside the fiefdom who lived pretty close to the castle would run to the castle. They go up that little ramp. You see that little walkway that's going into the front of the castle down at the bottom of the photo. Well, they would walk in there, they'd close the drawbridge, or they'd close the gate and everything, and they'd protect all of the population of the fiefdom. And all those taxes that they had paid, all the food that they had donated, all that food would be used to sustain the population inside the castle during the siege. A well fortified and well stocked castle could withstand a siege of a year or more, and many did. And especially if they had really high walls like this one. This one even has a moat around it. And so nobody could, it's not like they didn't have alligators in the moat or anything, but nobody could swim. And the moat was usually filled with really grody water. So you didn't want to go swimming in that stuff because you kind of knew where it had been. Plus, they had very narrow windows, so archers could shoot at the army from places where they were much more protected. It was it was pretty much impenetrable. If it was well built and well fortified, you couldn't get inside the castle. And so it became harder, and as these castles, kind of popped up, it became harder and harder for people to take land from anybody else. And so it protected that area from siege. And that was the whole point behind it. So, and there was no cannon at this point. There was no, gun. There were no guns. There was just no way to get inside the castle itself. So kind of like the armor that the knights wore. I mean, some of those suits of armor could actually weigh 50 pounds, and yet they were very protective. You couldn't shoot an arrow and just have it go right through the armor. So that it's the same thing. This is, they seem like kind of big, blocky, clumsy buildings today, and yet they really did protect the people inside. Some cities also had these, and the cities would put a wall around the entire city. Quite a few cities in Spain, for instance, when I went to Avila and Toledo, both of those have still a surviving wall that goes around the entire extent of the older part of the city. Avila's is actually, I think, 25 feet tall, and it's somewhere between 10 and 20 feet thick all the way around. It's really amazing. It's quite beautiful too. So you can look up Avila, and I might even show you a picture just because it's fun. Maybe I'll put a picture in to let me see if I can just find Avila, because it's just too pretty. And I'll just share a different, yeah, that's a good picture. Okay, and I'm just going to show you, share this with you really quick, so that you can kind of see where we're going. I'm going to stop that sharing, and then I'm going to share a different something. So if you want to see, that's what Avila looks like, and it's in Spain. But you can see how those are taller windows, the taller walls in between, and then they have these little ramparts in the middle. Really, every 25, 30 feet or so, they would put these, and those were lookout stations, so that each one of them has a little door on the inside of the wall, and the wall encompasses the entire city. You see all that? And then the castle, the main castle that Avila was, that was the center of that city, you can see up in the up in that way in the background on the right hand side, all lit up. And so it was up on the hill in the middle of the city proper, and then they actually built a wall completely around the city. So it's quite extraordinary, in my opinion. Okay, so let's go back to WebEx, and let's stop that sharing, and we'll go back to the hopefully you didn't mind that, because it's just a really good way of illustrating all of it. And you can look up pictures of any of that, and you can see kind of what's going on with all of that. So, but they did, they had a lot of fortifications, a lot of soldiers were inside the castle too, to shoot outwards, or to, if they put up ladders to try to climb the walls, they would knock the ladders down, or they would, stab people when they got up. They did actually use things like tar and boiling oil. And so if somebody made it through the drawbridge area, or, past the gate, then they would pour the oil through holes in the ceiling and actually burn them to death. It was a horrible way to die, because you can't get tar off. So you just, it's just a mess. But, and I already kind of went through that. Now we get to a certain aspect, and I talked about William the Conqueror taking over, and he was a French king. Well, he was from Normandy. Normandy is actually named after the Northmen or Norsemen, and those are the Vikings. So most geneticists say that if anybody has any red hair at all, so if there's a redhead in the family, or if a man's beard grows out and it has a reddish tinge to it, he probably has Viking blood. Because the Vikings, it's funny because the Vikings were known for their red hair, and yet they're also the reason why Russia is named Russia, because it's from the French word Russe, which means red, and because they were very redheaded. And from what we understand, there are quite a few redheaded Russians as well, even today. But the Vikings at first just raided places in Northern Europe, but then after a while they settled, and so they settled, in Norway, they settled in Sweden and other places like that. And then they settled in Russia, but then a large contingency of them settled in northern France, and it became called Normandy. It's still the Normandy region, that people would know what that is if you went to France. So that northern part of France. Well, they decided at some point that they were going to take over more territory. And so as a unified group, they started kind of going down Europe and attacking all these strongholds everywhere, and taking over and taking over and taking over. And so eventually Normandy and the Normans would take over most of Europe, including even England. And that's probably the most dramatic shift, because that was probably the most violent battle or set of battles that they waged against Harold II, who was the King of England at the time. And it's actually commemorated in the tapestry, the Bayeux tapestry, that we'll cover too in art. But in the Battle of Hastings in 1066, Harold II met William the Conqueror, and he's called the Conqueror because he conquered so much stuff, including Harold II. He was killed in battle, and that the court did for 300 years. The court in England was a French-speaking court, not English. And it really wasn't until closer to, the end of the War of the Roses, and closer to the beginning of the Tudor era, that the court went fully English. Now, the Bayeux tapestry, which is listed here, is it's unique for two reasons. First, it's embroidered on fabric, and yet it is still in fantastic shape. Most fabric and embroidery, things like this, most of these kinds of textiles do not last even a century, let alone for centuries. So in 1086, we know this was created entirely by women. It is 231 feet long, and it was originally meant to hang inside, kind of like a border, an upper border, within one particular very, very large room. Now it is not, it's actually in a kind of case, and it lines the case, but you can follow it along at kind of at eye level and see all of the different scenes. But it was entirely created by women. So it kind of looks like it could have been, it's a lot of the same coloring as in an illuminated manuscript. And yet these are dyed yarns. And this was actually embroidered, and it was entirely done by women, because women were the ones who embroidered way back then. So there are 79 total scenes that tell the entire story of the travel to England and the Battle of Hastings and the death of Harold and taking over as William the Conqueror. So, William taking over as king. So it's all kind of, it's a beautiful tapestry, but it took a tremendous amount of work for this to happen. Okay, so then we get to, once the Normans are all done and they've taken over all of Europe, well, there's no more battle to be done. And there is a rule of primogeniture. So the first son, the first child within a family inherits everything. That's the standard in Europe and European tribal society. So if you, for instance, are a guy who has, a wife and you get married and have kids, and then maybe she dies and then you have another wife and you have more kids, say that you have 6 sons. Well, only the first son is going to inherit. That leaves 5 sons of noble birth with nothing to do and no wealth. That's not good. And they don't want to live off the oldest son, and the oldest son doesn't want them to live off him. And so they got to go find something to do. Now, they could enter the priesthood, they could become, enter a trade, they could do a lot of different things. At this time, though, most of the younger sons wanted to go and get wealth for themselves. They were going to go out and seek their fortune. And the easiest way to do that is to attack other places and take wealth. But you couldn't really attack other Christian communities, especially if all of them were also Normans. And so what happened was there was already some dissension among the caliphates in northern Africa and in the Middle East, where they had territories that were traditionally Jewish and Christian as well as Muslim. And so a lot of people were trying to go on crusades, not crusades, they were trying to go on pilgrimages to visit Jerusalem, for instance, or to visit other holy sites, and they were getting heckled, and they were getting, it wasn't an easy journey because they were in Islamic territory. Already, too, the Catholic Church was really upset that Islam had taken over so much of what once had been the Roman Empire. And so Pope Urban actually in 1095 declared that they needed to get Jerusalem back. They need the holy city put back into the correct hands of the true church, of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. And so they need to attack the Muslim communities and take all that territory back. So that's the order. And in addition, if you died fighting in the Crusades, fighting those horrible Muslim people, then you would automatically go to heaven. Your soul would be saved because you were dying for the right cause. And so that's what happened. People, all that feudalism, where the vassals were supposed to help the lords, and the lords were supposed to help the king. Well, they all moved in the direction of Jerusalem, and they started the Crusades. The first crusade was in 1095. It really depends on which historian you ask how many there were. They were horrible. The fighting on both sides was violent, and it included the killing of women and children and old people who weren't any part of the fighting. Women were raped and taken as slaves and killed. Children were slaughtered. Children were eaten. Some of the battles, literally, they say, well, there's not enough food, and they would take the dead bodies of the Muslims they had killed, and they would boil them in a pot and eat them. And we know this from accounts, both from Christian accounts and from Muslim accounts, that this happened. These were not, as much as the Pope might have wanted it to be a holy war, or people from back in Europe might have seen it as such, it was a very unholy war. It was horrifying. And in the end, the church didn't just take on the Muslims, they took on Jews, heretics, agnostics or atheists, every other kind of Christian that existed, including the Arians and the Gnostics and the Greek Orthodox Church. And so they went to battle against every single person or community that was not Holy Roman Catholic. And did they win? No. They caused a lot of, they did bring back a lot of treasure. So those second and third and fourth and fifth and sixth sons came back with wealth, but at the cost, they murdered countless people. We don't know exactly how many people died in the Crusades, but it was so lucrative, like the first and second waves, because they could go and they could sack an entire city, and who cares, because those were all Muslim people anyway, or Jewish, or Gnostics, or Greek Orthodox. And so they could take all their stuff and kill them all, and they just didn't feel bad about it because they weren't real Christians. And so they did that again and again and again, mostly for the wealth. It's not something that, it's not a point of pride in our history. This is really a time when religion was used as an excuse to create a tremendous level of violence and destruction. So, but what the only good thing to come out of it, really, and it was a good thing, is that it was the beginning of a reconnection to the Silk Road and to China and Chinese artistry and Chinese technology. And so for a long time, because of this rift between Islam and Christianity, the Christian kingdoms in Europe were completely cut off from trade with China and Japan. But the Muslim lands still had constant contact with them, and they actually had developed a lot more of their technology. They had a much more sophisticated medical community and medical training, and a much better, awareness of science and math. And much of that had been cut off from Europe. After this would end, one of the things that happened is that trade route opened back up, and a lot of the Chinese technologies and a lot of the Arabic writings from the Muslim community suddenly were accessed by Europeans. This would eventually lead to or contribute to the beginnings of the Renaissance, because they'd have access to literature they had and science they had not had access to in centuries. So the truth is all that that technology and invention will actually end up ending feudalism as we know it, because we're going to have access to the cannon, and we're going to have access eventually to gunfire and other things that will make wearing a 50-pound piece of armor completely moot. So and it definitely did weaken feudalism somewhat, but it actually strengthened the Holy Roman Catholic Church, because everybody united under their banner. And so people became resoundingly Holy Roman Catholic. And that also started a little pilgrimage group where they would take pilgrimages all the way around. You can see the northern Spain was still predominantly Christian, so they'd kind of follow along that pilgrimage, going and visiting churches. So instead of going to Disney World, they went and visited churches and relics in those churches all over the place. So let's talk briefly about the cathedrals. Now, I don't know if you remember me talking about the Latin cross, but the Latin cross is right here. You can see the shape of it in the footprint of this church. And it was achieved even within that cross. Up above on the top of the cross would be Romanesque arches. So the arch tunnels, just those rounded arches, would be very standard ceilings, and they'd be very, very high, quite beautiful. But the inner hallways would be quite narrow. So you can, yes, they'd be super tall, but they're so tall that you had really thick colonnades. The pillars that held all of these ceilings up were very, very thick and heavy, because they had to be to take all that weight. And so the areas were very narrow. So you can see there's a hallway on either side that's even narrower, but even within this, you probably only have about 12 people who can sit across in a row all the way down. So it's not a very wide sanctuary, and you really have to sit within this inner part of it, this central part. Otherwise you can't see. The colonnades are so big. Some of these colonnades can be as wide as 8 or 10 feet in diameter, and so they're so big you can't see past them. You can see even from this photograph, we can't see between the colonnades from our angle, but it's quite beautiful. They had even the arched windows at the end. So there's light usually over at the where the nave is, and where they would do communion and do the service itself. And yet the inner sanctum part was actually pretty dark. The windows had to be pretty small so that they could support the heavy walls. And so you can see this is a pretty dark cathedral, but this is Romanesque. You can see, I'm sure you can see some of the styling of the Roman arch, and certainly the stone and the concrete that was used. That's very typical of older Rome too, but you can see there's more stained glass. There's actually more design elements, and there's some little furbelows and that are not typical of more ancient Roman architecture. So it's quite beautiful. It still is lovely. The other thing that was cool, and I'll actually post a link, but you can look it up. If you looked up plain song or you looked up what is called Gregorian chant, that's pretty much the music of the medieval period. Well, there are two sides. There's religious music and there's secular or non-religious music. Religious music was almost all what is called monophonic. And in fact, secular was too, where they sang one melody and only one melody. And if you had instrumentation, even in the non-religious music, the instrument would play the same notes as the person sang. So everything was in unison. There was no harmony, and there were no like under melodies or anything like that. Everything was exactly the same pace, exactly the same notes. They didn't really have notation until closer to the end of the medieval period, and yet they did write down words, and then they tried to indicate whether the notes were higher or lower. By the end of the medieval period, they'll actually have the staff system that we use today to read music, where we know exactly based on what line it's on or what line it's covering, what note it is exactly. And so that would eventually happen, and then those books would be copied, and then people could share music. We know what this is though because it was passed on orally. And so if you want to look up, I would strongly urge you, but once you finish this to go look up plain song or Gregorian chant, and you're going to in YouTube, and you can hear what it sounds like. It's quite lovely. And I'll show you, I'll actually give you a demonstration next time that will play a kind of show you how the plain song turned into polyphony later on. But right now it's just, one person sings a melody and then a whole chorus sings in unison a similar melody, and it's only vocal. You never had inside the church, you would never have both vocals and instrumental music at the same time. You could play an instrument with no vocals, or you could sing a cappella. You could sing without instrumentation. Secular music usually had instrumentation, and there could be a few people singing or one person singing, but there were no parts. Everybody sang in unison, and the notes of your flute or the notes of your lyre or whatever instruments went with it would be playing the same notes. And so it was all kind of mirroring. Now that music though, all the music inside the church was in Latin, and it was all based on psalms or religious doctrine. Inside, in secular music, in the courtly world outside the church, the music was very bawdy. A lot about illicit love affairs, a lot about illicit love, outside of marriage. Definitely a lot of knights and ladies and fanciful stories and narratives. And this is where we get the beginnings of what will become Arthurian literature. A lot of stuff that will come about King Arthur or other kings with their knights, and they're going on adventures and things like that. So, and these are in very different languages. I mean, we have language, German. There are surviving texts and songs that are in German, in French, in Danish, and in Scandinavian languages, in English, in Spanish. So it was pretty much all across the board. The other thing that they had were medieval plays that were performed but they're not like Greek theater or Roman theater because they were all religious. They could only, because the Holy Roman Catholic Church controlled all of this. And so they would have on festival days, they would have religious festivals, they'd have little parades, and craftsmen would, in guilds, would actually take little parts. They were only men, women were not allowed on stage still. And they would perform in a series of small scenes, little 5 or 10 minute plays, the birth of Jesus, or Jesus' death and crucifixion and resurrection, or even kind of like a apocryphal sort of thing where they talk about the last judgment and Jesus versus Satan and the final battle and then the end of days, and where we get to essentially face have our final reckoning. And all of those were, of course, to both pass along the message of Christianity in English or German. These were plays in the vernacular. So they were written in the common languages so people could understand them, not in Latin. But that was helping get the message through. This is what our faith means. Because again, most of Mass, most of the church service was in Latin, which no one could understand. And no one could read the Bible because they couldn't read Latin and they couldn't read. So the church held a very strong control over what people were told to believe about what church practice was supposed to be and how we were to worship. So it was really interesting how all that happened. And we're going to talk about, when we get to the next chapter, how that affected the view of the church over time, because the church would become more and more harsh in its punishments of people who went against their ideas, and it will eventually lead to the Protestant Reformation. But that won't be until chapter 8. So see you next time for chapter 6, when I'll talk really about church more than anything else. And if you don't like church, it'll be over soon, I promise. Take care, and I'll talk to you later.